So, hello and welcome back to A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, a book that so far has been very wordy. I see that there is the vestiges of a story emerging, which is good because, like I said, I swear I've read this book before, and I'm pretty sure I thought it was pretty good, at least as far as classics go. But yeah, it's been maybe tough getting this far, but we are going to persevere. I I mean, it's got to be a classic for a moment or for a reason. You don't get to be a classic just by being terrible. Not that this is terrible. The descriptions have been quite amusing, if a bit extended. Which, it's so funny because I love authors like Robert Jordan, who a lot of people accused of being far too wordy and far too descriptive, or Stephen King, who can do description with the best of them. But I think the biggest difference there is you also get more story in with the description or something. I don't know. I am probably just a spoiled modern reader who just doesn't have the patience for, at least so far, Mr. Dickens. But like I said, there is the beginning of a story. Jerry and young Jerry are quite interesting, although what they have to do with the people that we met in the last chapter or the last book, I don't know, but I guess we're going to find out. So, with all of that being said, and with me fairly miserable because winter has returned, it's not supposed to be here long, and then it's supposed to go away, and then it's supposed to come back again, because this is March, and if March doesn't come in like a lion, then how can it go out like a lamb? That's where I'm going with that. That's what I'm hoping anyway. So I'm going to ignore the fact that the wind is howling and it's snowing, and we are going to dive back into London in the 1700s with Charles Dickens's story, A Tale of Two Cities, Book 2, The Golden Thread, Chapter 2, A Sight. You know the Old Bailey well, no doubt, said one of the oldest clerks to Jerry the messenger. Yes, sir, said Jerry, in something of a dogged manner. I do know the Bailey. Just so. And you know Mr. Lorry? I I know Mr. Lorry, sir, much better than I know the Bailey. Much better, said Jerry, not unlike a reluctant witness at the establishment in question. Much better than I, as an honest tradesman, wish to know the Bailey. Very well. Find the door where the witnesses go in, and show the doorkeeper this note for Mr. Lorry. He will then let you in. Into the court, sir? Into the court. Mr. Cruncher's eyes seemed to get a little closer together and to interchange the inquiry of, "What do you think of this?" Am I to wait in the court, sir? He said, as a result of that conference with himself. I am going to tell you. The doorkeeper will pass the note to Mr. Lorry, and do you make any gesture that will attract Mr. Lorry's attention and show him where you stand. Then what you have to do is remain there until he wants you. Is that all, sir? That's all. He wishes to have a messenger at hand. This is to tell him that you are there. As this ancient clerk deliberately folded and superscribed the note, Mr. Cruncher, after surveying him in silence until he came to the blotting paper stage, said, I suppose they'll be trying forgeries this morning. Treason. That's quartering, said Jerry. Barbarous. It is the law, said the ancient clerk, turning his surprised spectacles upon Jerry. It is the law. It's hard in the law to spile a man, I think. It's hard enough to kill him, but very hard to spile him, sir. Not at all, said the clerk. Speak well of the law. Take care of your chest and voice, my friend, and leave the law to care for itself. I give you that advice. It is the damp, sir, what settles on my chest and voice, said Jerry. I'll leave you to judge what a damp way of earning a living mine is. Well, well, said the clerk. We all have our various ways of gaining a livelihood. Some of us have damp ways, and some of us have dry ways. Here's the letter. Get along. Jerry took the letter, and, remarking to himself with less internal deference than he made a show of, he said, You're a lean old one, too. And he made his bow, informed his son as he passed of his destination, and went upon his way. They did the hanging at Tyburn in those days, so the street outside Newgate had not obtained the infamous notoriety that has since been attached to it. But the jail was a vile place, in which most kinds of debauchery and villainy were practiced, and where dire diseases were bred, that came into court with the prisoners, and sometimes rushed straight from the dock at my Lord Chief Justice himself and pulled him off the bench. It had more than once happened that the judge in the black cap pronounced his own doom as certainly as the prisoners, and sometimes even died before that one. For the rest, the Old Bailey was famous as a kind of deadly inn-yard from which pale travelers set out continually in carts and coaches on a violent passage into the other world, traversing some 2.5 miles of public street and road, and shaming few good citizens, if any. So powerful is use, so desirable to be good use in the beginning. It was famous, too, for the pillory, that wise old institution that inflicted a punishment of which no one could foresee the extent of. Also famous for the whipping post, another dear old institution, very humanizing and softening to behold in action. Also for extensive transactions in blood money, another fragment of ancestral wisdom, systematically leading to the most frightful mercenary crimes that could be committed under heaven. Altogether, the Old Bailey at that date was a choice illustration of the precept, whatever is right, an amorphism that would be as final as it is lazy, did it not include the troublesome consequence that nothing ever was wrong. Making his way through that tainted crowd, dispersed up and down this hideous scene of action, with the skill of a man accustomed to making his way quietly, Jerry found the door that he sought and handed his letter through a trap in it. For people then paid to see the play at the Old Bailey, just as they pay to see the play in Bedlam sometimes, only the former entertainment was much the dearer, and therefore all the Old Bailey doors were well guarded, except indeed the social doors by which criminals got there. Those were always left wide open. After some delay, the doorman grudgingly opened the door a little way and allowed Mr. Jerry Cruncher to squeeze himself into the court. "What's going on?" he asked in a whisper of the man that he found himself next to. "Nothing yet." "What's coming on?" "The treason case." "The quarter in one, eh?" "Ah," said the man with relish. He'll be drawn on a hurdle to be half hanged, then he'll be taken down and sliced before his own face, and then his insides will be taken out and burnt while he is watching, and then his head will be chopped up, and he'll be cut into quarters. That's the sentence." "If he's found guilty, you mean," said Jerry. "Oh, they'll find him guilty," said the other. "Don't you be afraid of that." Mr. Cruncher's attention was here diverted to the doorkeeper, who he saw making his way to Mr. Lorry with the note in hand. Mr. Lorry sat at a table among the gentlemen in wigs, not far from a Whig gentleman, the prisoner's counsel, who had a great bundle of papers before him, and almost opposite another Whig gentleman with his hands in his pockets, whose whole attention, when Mr. Cruncher looked at him, either then or after, seemed to be concentrated on the ceiling of the court. After some gruff coughing and rubbing of his chin and signaling with his hand, Jerry attracted the notice of Mr. Lorry, who had stood to look for him and who quietly nodded and then sat again. "What's he got to do with the case?" said the man that Jerry had spoken with. "Blessed if I know," said Jerry. "What have you got to do with it, then, if I may inquire?" "Blessed if I know that either," said Jerry. The entry of the judge and a consequent great stir and settling down in the court stopped all dialogue. Presently, the dock became the central point of interest. 2 jailers, who had been standing there, went out, and the prisoner brought in and put to the bar. Everybody present, except one Whig gentleman who was looking at the ceiling, turned and stared at him. All the human breath in the place rolled at him like a sea or wind or fire. Eager faces strained round the pillars and corners to get a sight of him. Spectators in the back rows stood up so not to miss a hair on his head. People on the floor of the court laid their hands upon the shoulders of the people in front of them to help themselves, at anyone's cost, to get a view. They stood a tiptoe, got upon ledges, stood up on next to nothing so that they could see every inch of the man. Conspicuous among these, like an animated bit of the spiked wall of Newgate, Jerry stood, aiming at the prisoner the beery breath of a whet he had taken as he came in, and discharging it to mingle with the waves of other beer, gin, tea, and coffee, and what not that was flowing at the prisoner, and had already broken upon the great windows behind him like an impure mist and rain. The object of all of this staring and blaring was a young man of about 25, well grown and well looking, with a sunburnt cheek and a dark eye. His condition was that of a young gentleman. He was plainly dressed in black or dark gray, and his hair, which was long and dark, was gathered in a ribbon at the back of his neck, more to keep it out of the way than as an ornament. As an emotion of the mind will express itself through any covering of the body, so the paleness which his situation engendered came through the brown on his cheeks, so showing the soul to be stronger than the sun. Otherwise he was quite self-possessed. He bowed to the judge and stood quietly. The sort of interest with which this man was stared and breathed at was not a sort that elevated humanity. Had he stood in peril of a less horrid sentence, had there been a chance of any one of its savage details being spared, by just so much would he have lost his fascination. The form that was to be doomed to be so shamefully mangled was the sight. The immortal creature that was to be so butchered and ripped asunder, yielding the sensation. Whatever gloss the various spectators put upon the interest according to their several arts and powers of self-defeat, the interest was, at its very heart, ogreish. Silence in the court. Charles Darnay had yesterday pleaded not guilty to an indictment denouncing him, with infinite jingle and jangle, that he was a false traitor to our serene, illustrious, excellent, and so forth Lord King, by reason of his having on diverse occasions and by diverse means and ways assisting Louis the French king in his wars against our said serene, illustrious, excellent, and so forth, that was to say, by coming and going between dominions of our said serene, illustrious, excellent, and so forth, and those of the said French Louis, and wickedly, falsely, traitorously, and otherwise evilly reveling or revealing to the said French King Louis what forces our serene, illustrious, excellent, and so forth had been preparing to send to Canada and North America. This much, Jerry, with his head becoming more and more spiky as the law terms came bristling at it, made out with huge satisfaction, and so arrived circuitously at the understanding that the foresaid and over again foresaid Charles Darnay, who stood there before him upon his trial, that the jury were swearing in, and that Mr. Attorney General was making ready to speak. The accused, who was, and who knew he was, being mentally hanged, beheaded, and quartered by everyone there, neither flinched from the situation nor assumed any theatrical air in it. He was quiet and attentive. He watched the opening proceedings with a grave interest, and he stood with his hands resting on the slab of wood before him, so composedly that they had not displaced a leaf of the herbs with which it was strewn. The court was completely bestrewn with herbs and sprinkled with vinegar as a precaution against the jail air and jail fevers. Over the prisoner's head there was a mirror to throw the light down upon him. Crowds of the wicked and the wretched had been reflected in it, and had passed from its surface and this earth's altogether. Haunted in a most ghastly manner, that abominable place would have been if the glass could ever have rendered back its reflections, as the ocean is supposed to one day give up its dead. Some passing thought of the infamy and disgrace for which it had been reserved may have struck the prisoner's mind. But be that as it may, a change in his position making him conscious of a bar of light across his face, he looked up, and when he saw the glass, his face flushed, and his hands pushed the herbs away. It happened that the action turned his face to that side of the court which was on his left. About on a level with his eyes, there sat in the corner of the judge's bench two people upon whom his look immediately rested. So immediately, and so much to the changing of his aspect, that everyone turned their eyes upon him, and then turned to them. The spectators saw in the two figures a young lady of little more than 20, and a gentleman who was evidently her father, a man of quite remarkable appearance in respect of the absolute whiteness of his hair and a certain indescribable intensity upon his face, not of an active kind, but pondering and self-commuting. When this expression was upon him, he looked as if he were old, but when it was stirred and broken, as it was now, in a moment, his speaking to his daughter, suddenly he would become a handsome man, not quite past the prime of life. His daughter had one of her hands drawn through his arm as she sat by him, and her other hand pressed upon his arm. She had drawn close to him in her dread of the scene and her pity for the prisoner. Her forehead had been strikingly expressive of an engrossing terror and compassion that saw nothing but peril for the accused. This had been so very noticeable, so very powerfully and naturally shown, that those staring who had no pity for him were then touched by her, and the whisper went around the court, "Who are they?" Jerry, the messenger who had made his own observations in his own manner, and who had been sucking the rust off his fingers in his absorption, stretched his neck so that he could hear who they were. The crowd around him had pressed and passed the inquiry on to the nearest attendant, and from him it had been more slowly pressed and passed back till finally it got to Jerry. "Witnesses." "For which side?" "Against." "Against whose side?" "The prisoner." The judge, whose eyes had gone in that general direction, recalled them and leaned back in his seat and looked steadily at the man whose life he held in his hand, as Mr. Attorney General rose to spin the rope, grind the axe, and hammer the nails into the prisoner's coffin. And that is the end of our chapter. And the next chapter is even longer, so we're just going to do one tonight. But all right, we're starting to get players in place. The court terms almost did me in, but the person on the back of the book, at least one of the people, Mr. Charles Darnay, has been entered, and I'm hoping that he is going to be found innocent, or why would he be on the back of the book? Also, I'm pretty sure that that is Mr. and Miss Manette in the witness stand. So I'm kind of curious now. I have to admit, book one was tedious, but book two is grabbing my interest. Still far too wordy. Mr. Dickens, if I could speak to you through the ages, I would tell you to get an editor and tighten that bad boy up. But who am I to say anything like that against one of the more celebrated authors of history? So I'll just keep that mostly to myself, and of course tell you guys all of the thoughts in my head that probably mark me as a thoroughly modern and, I was going to say not well read, but I've read lots and lots of books. I just haven't read many of the classics. But, you know, we're amending that now. So thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed that chapter. I hope that I didn't lose you as much as I almost lost me in that whole figuring out what the charges are. It sounds like Charles Darnay is being accused of being a spy for the French. That's what it kind of seems to be shaking out to me. If I'm wrong about that, let me know. But anyway, thank you so much. Please do hit the thumbs up on your way out, and I will see you tomorrow.